After Eleanor Whitmore's father, a man the world believed was ordinary, but who secretly controlled a trillion-dollar empire, died, her powerful stepmother threw her out of the mansion for feeding a poor, crippled beggar. But Eleanor had no idea that the man she knelt beside in the rain was her family's lawyer, the only person who knew the truth, and the one who would soon read a will that would turn mercy into judgment. Eleanor was just 20, grieving, homeless, and stripped of status. But her stepmother Margaret stood tall in diamonds, certain she had won everything, while the crippled beggar watched silently from the shadows, his role hidden, his presence deliberate. One act of kindness looked like weakness, but one quiet decision was already rewriting power, inheritance, and fate. When the will is finally opened, who truly inherits the secret trillions? Why was the beggar chosen to test her? And what did Eleanor do when the truth left her stepmother begging for mercy? No one at Charles Whitmore's funeral knew the truth, but every detail of that day was quietly deciding who would rise and who would fall. To the guests seated beneath the gray sky, Charles Whitmore had been a reserved financial consultant, a man who wore the same plain suits for years and spoke little at charity events. But to the woman standing closest to the casket, his second wife, Margaret Whitmore, his death marked something else entirely. Freedom. She dabbed her eyes with practiced elegance, her black dress tailored to perfection, diamond earrings catching the light as mourners passed by. Margaret accepted condolences like a queen receiving tribute, her grip firm, her voice soft but commanding. To her, this wasn't a goodbye. It was a transition of power. A few steps behind her stood Eleanor Whitmore, 20 years old, dressed in a simple black coat that had once belonged to her father. She didn't cry loudly. She didn't cling to anyone. She stood still, her hands folded, her face calm but hollow, absorbing the weight of a world that had just vanished. Eleanor had always been invisible in rooms like this, but never unimportant. She was Charles Whitmore's only child, raised on principles instead of privilege, taught restraint instead of entitlement. She had never been told how wealthy her father truly was, but she had been taught something far more dangerous: kindness. As the last prayer ended and the crowd began to thin, Margaret turned, not toward Eleanor, but away from her. The message was silent but sharp. You no longer belong. That silence followed Eleanor back to the Whitmore estate later that afternoon. The mansion, once warm with quiet evenings and her father's measured routines, felt different now, colder, sharper, as if the walls themselves had shifted allegiance. Staff moved carefully, eyes downcast, responding not to Eleanor, but to Margaret's clipped commands. Margaret wasted no time. She dismissed household, employees Eleanor had grown up with. She changed locks. She ordered renovations Eleanor hadn't been consulted about. And with every decision, she smiled, because she believed the estate, the future, and whatever inheritance existed already belonged to her. Eleanor said nothing. She stayed in her room, sorting through her father's old books, his notes scribbled in the margins, his careful handwriting reminding her that the man she loved was gone, but not his lessons. Then came the rain. By late afternoon, dark clouds rolled in, drenching the long gravel driveway. Security guards closed the gates as a man appeared outside them. Thin, hunched, dragging one leg as he struggled forward. He was a beggar. His clothes were torn, his hair matted, his face weathered by years of neglect. He leaned heavily on a makeshift crutch, pausing every few steps, his breath shallow but controlled. The guards ignored him. Margaret noticed him immediately. "Get him out of here," she snapped. "I will not have that kind of spectacle outside my home." The guards hesitated, but followed orders. Eleanor saw the man from the front window. She watched as the guards waved him away, as rain soaked through his clothes, as he struggled to turn back down the road. Something in his posture, his quiet dignity, the way he didn't beg or shout, made her heart tighten. She didn't ask permission. She grabbed a tray of food from the kitchen, took an umbrella, and walked outside. Margaret followed her to the door. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. Eleanor didn't turn around. She crossed the driveway, knelt in the rain, and placed the tray gently beside the man. "My name is Eleanor," she said softly. "Please eat." The man looked at her, really looked, and for a brief moment, his eyes held something unexpected: intelligence, awareness, control. "My name is Henry Caldwell," he replied calmly. Eleanor smiled and handed him a bottle of water. Margaret exploded. She stormed forward, her heels sinking into the wet gravel, fury etched into every line of her face. "This is disgraceful," Margaret hissed. "You are feeding beggars at my gate like we're some kind of shelter." Eleanor stood. "He's hungry," she said quietly. "That's all that matters." That was the moment Margaret decided Eleanor's fate. In front of the staff, the guards, and the rain-soaked man, Margaret pointed toward the road. "Pack your things," she said coldly. "You're done here." Eleanor didn't argue. She went upstairs, filled her father's old suitcase, and walked out of the estate with nothing but clothes, memories, and the calm certainty that she had done nothing wrong. As she passed Henry Caldwell, he looked up at her once more. "Kindness has a cost," he said. Eleanor nodded. "I know," she replied. She had no idea how high that cost would be, or how much it would be worth. Eleanor Whitmore slept her first night away from the Whitmore estate on a narrow couch in a small community shelter across town, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she refused to ask anyone for help she hadn't earned. The shelter smelled faintly of detergent and old books. The walls were plain. The silence was heavy but honest. It reminded her of the quiet evenings she used to share with her father, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, while he read financial journals and she worked through college applications. She woke before dawn. Grief pressed into her chest the moment her eyes opened, but so did clarity. Her father was gone, but the lessons he had drilled into her were not. Dignity, patience. Never explain yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. That morning, Eleanor received an email from a law firm she barely recognized. Caldwell and Pierce, attorneys at law. The subject line was brief but formal. Final will reading. Bill. Mandatory attendance. She stared at the name Caldwell longer than she should have. Something about it felt familiar. By the time Eleanor arrived at the law office downtown, Margaret Whitmore was already there. Seated confidently at the head of the long conference table, dressed in a tailored navy suit, her posture relaxed, her expression victorious. She barely glanced at Eleanor. Margaret assumed the girl had come to beg. Executives, accountants, and legal representatives filled the room. People Eleanor had never seen before. People her father had deliberately kept separate from his family life. They whispered among themselves, flipping through documents thick with tabs and seals. Margaret crossed her legs slowly. "Let's not waste time," she said. "I assume this is a formality." The door opened. The man who walked in was not the crippled beggar from the rain, but he was unmistakably the same person. Henry Caldwell stood tall, clean-shaven, dressed in a charcoal suit so precise it silenced the room. He leaned lightly on a polished cane, his presence commanding, his eyes sharp. Margaret frowned. Eleanor froze. Henry took his seat at the front of the room and placed a leather-bound folder on the table. "My name is Henry Caldwell," he said calmly. "Senior partner, executor of Charles Whitmore's estate." The temperature in the room changed instantly. Margaret laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "This is some kind of joke," she said. "I saw you begging outside my house." Henry met her gaze without blinking. "Yes," he replied. "You did." The laughter died. Henry opened the folder. "For over 30 years, I have served as Charles Whitmore's legal counsel," he continued. I also served as his firewall, his test, and his safeguard. Margaret's confidence wavered, but only slightly. Henry began to read. The will did not start with money. It started with conditions. Charles Whitmore had structured his empire through layered trusts, shell foundations, and silent partnerships across global markets. The numbers were staggering. Banks, infrastructure funds, technology portfolios, entire industries quietly under his control. But ownership meant nothing without character. Every potential beneficiary had been evaluated, observed, tested. Margaret stiffened as Henry listed incidents, documented patterns of cruelty toward staff, financial manipulation, dismissive treatment of charity recipients, verbal abuse carefully recorded through affidavits, and surveillance authorized years earlier. "You failed every threshold," Henry said plainly. Margaret stood abruptly. "This is absurd," she snapped. "I was his wife." Henry nodded. "Yes," he said. "And you treated power as entitlement instead of responsibility." Then he turned the page. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said. Eleanor straightened. Henry read slowly, deliberately, each word landing like a measured verdict. Her actions, her restraint, her refusal to humiliate others even when provoked, her compassion toward a man she believed to be powerless, her dignity in exile. These actions, Henry said, activated the final clause. Margaret's breath hitched. Eleanor Whitmore was declared the sole controlling beneficiary of the Whitmore Global Trust. At 20 years old. Margaret's knees buckled as she whispered, "That's impossible." Henry closed the folder. "Mercy," he said, "was the qualification." Margaret collapsed into her chair. She begged. She accused Eleanor of manipulation, of deception, of being too soft to rule such power. Eleanor stood quietly. She looked at Margaret, not with triumph, but with understanding. "My father didn't hide his wealth," Eleanor said softly. "He hid people from it." Henry nodded once. The meeting ended. Margaret had nothing, and Eleanor had everything, but hadn't yet decided what to do with it. Margaret Whitmore's fall did not happen all at once. It happened in stages, quiet, precise, and irreversible. Within 48 hours of the will reading, control of the Whitmore estate shifted hands. Board members who once returned Margaret's calls within seconds suddenly routed her to assistance. Credit cards tied to trust accounts were frozen. Invitations stopped arriving. The mansion that had felt like a throne only days earlier became a place of echoes and unanswered questions. Margaret told herself it was temporary. She told herself Eleanor would panic, would hesitate, would make a mistake, because young girls always did when power arrived too fast. She waited for the call that would invite her back into relevance. It never came. Eleanor Whitmore moved differently. She didn't rush to the estate. She didn't announce herself to the press. She didn't replace staff or issue grand statements. Instead, she spent days inside conference rooms with people who had once answered only to her father, listening, learning, asking precise questions. Henry Caldwell stayed beside her, not guiding her hand, but watching. She absorbed the structure of the empire, the same way she had absorbed her father's lessons at the kitchen table, quietly, completely, without ego. Every trust, every condition, every contingency plan had been designed not for domination, but for stability. And Eleanor understood that instinctively. The first time Margaret reached out was a week later. She showed up unannounced at the law firm, not dressed in silk this time, but in a wrinkled coat, her confidence replaced with urgency. She demanded to see Eleanor, her voice cracking as she insisted this was all a misunderstanding. That family mattered more than paperwork. Henry Caldwell did not argue. He simply opened the door. Eleanor was standing by the window when Margaret entered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret broke first. "I raised you," she said. though the claim rang hollow. "I protected this family. You can't do this to me." Eleanor turned slowly. "I didn't do anything," she replied. "You did." Margaret's shoulders sagged. She begged then, not with dignity, but with desperation. She apologized for words she had once said proudly. She blamed grief, stress, fear, anything but herself. Eleanor listened, not because she owed Margaret forgiveness, but because she had learned the difference between power and cruelty. "My father planned for this," Eleanor said calmly. "Not because he wanted you punished, but because he wanted the truth revealed." Margaret's voice shook. "I have nothing," she whispered. "That's not true," Eleanor said. "You have exactly what he decided you needed." She nodded toward the trust summary on the table. A fixed stipend, medical coverage, housing assistance, enough to live, not enough to dominate. Margaret stared at the document, realization flooding her face. "You're sparing me," she said weakly. Eleanor shook her head. "No," she said. "I'm choosing not to become you." Silence filled the room. Margaret left without another word. That evening, Eleanor returned to the Whitmore estate for the first time since being expelled. The gates opened without question. Staff stood straighter, heads bowed, not out of fear, but respect. The house felt different again, not because it had been reclaimed, but because it had been reset. Henry joined her in the study where her father once worked. He would have been proud, Henry said. Eleanor ran her fingers across the desk. "He was testing more than money," she replied. "He was testing me." Henry smiled faintly. "And you passed without knowing you were being watched." Weeks later, Eleanor established a foundation, not in her name, but in her father's. It funded legal aid, rehabilitation programs, and anonymous support for people who had fallen through systems designed to forget them. Henry Caldwell returned to private life, his role complete. As for Eleanor Whitmore, the world would come to know her slowly, not as a secret trillionaire's daughter, but as something far rarer. A woman who inherited unimaginable power, but chose mercy without weakness, authority without cruelty, and legacy without arrogance. And in doing so, she proved that the greatest fortune her father ever left behind wasn't money. It was character. Years later, the Whitmore name no longer carried whispers. It carried weight. Not the loud, aggressive kind that demanded attention, but the quiet authority that made rooms listen before a word was spoken. Eleanor Whitmore rarely appeared in headlines, and when she did, journalists struggled to define her. She wasn't flashy enough to be sensational, and she wasn't distant enough to be untouchable. She was deliberate. At 27, Eleanor stood on the balcony of a renovated legal aid center in Chicago, one of dozens quietly funded through the Whitmore Foundation. Below her, people moved in and out of the building carrying files, hope, and second chances. No banners bore her name. No plaques announced her wealth. That had always been the point. Henry Caldwell had once told her that true power only reveals itself when it no longer needs to prove anything. Eleanor had learned that lesson early, long before boardrooms, trust documents, or balance sheets entered her vocabulary. She still remembered the rain. She remembered kneeling on wet gravel, handing food to a man the world had written off, unaware that the moment would rewrite her future. Not because of who he was, but because of who she chose to be. Margaret Whitmore faded from society quietly. She lived in a modest townhouse on the outskirts of the city, supported by the stipend she once considered an insult. Neighbors knew her as reserved, sometimes bitter, sometimes reflective. She volunteered occasionally, not out of ambition, but necessity. Power had stripped her of arrogance, leaving her with something unfamiliar: perspective. Eleanor never sought reconciliation, but she never blocked the door to it either. Mercy, she believed, was most powerful when it wasn't performative. On the anniversary of her father's death, Eleanor returned alone to the cemetery. She placed a single white rose beside the headstone and stood in silence. No cameras, no entourage, just a daughter honoring a man who had trusted her enough to test her without telling her why. "You were right," she said softly. "People reveal themselves when they think no one is watching." The wind stirred the trees. Eleanor smiled, not because she had won, but because she had remained herself. The world would never know how close it had come to creating another tyrant, disguised as a benefactor. It would only feel the aftershocks of a different choice, one that fed instead of hoarded, protected instead of crushed. And somewhere, in quiet places where no one was looking, kindness continued to compound, just as Charles Whitmore had intended.